Hi and welcome to Terry Talks Movies. This time we're going back into the hidden gems. I'm doing an A to Z of hidden gem movies using 5 movies from each of the 26 letters of the alphabet, though I may fudge that with the XYZs, but we'll see how we go when we get there. But at the moment we're at I and J. So let's get started doing 5 movies from the letter I and 5 movies from the letter J, which I consider to be hidden gems or just good enough to talk about. So we'll start with an obscurity from 1966, written by Larry Cohen, the great Larry Cohen. Now, Larry Cohen did a number of TV series, and they're always about outsiders. There was Branded with Chuck Connors, which was about a guy who was dismissed from the US Army for cowardice, even though he wasn't guilty of it. You've got The Invaders, which was about a guy who is trying to tell the world about UFOs, and he's an outsider on the run from the aliens themselves. And in between those two, we've got a little World War II TV series, which became a feature film when they spliced together 4 of the episodes after the series was unsuccessful. The series was called Blue Light, and the movie was called Ideal in Danger, with Robert Goulet starring as an American journalist called David March, who is one of 18 Blue Light agents who was sent into Germany before World War II to infiltrate themselves into the German hierarchies as American defectors. Now, all the other 17 have been caught and killed by the Nazis. The Nazis don't know who the 18th person in the Blue Light program was. And Robert Goulet as David March is that guy, and he still has to do all of his spy stuff while being shunned by the Americans and fated by the Germans. He's still passing information on to the American intelligence community, even though he's considered a traitor by his nation. It's a nice little series, and Robert Goulet wasn't a bad actor. He twisted things a little bit in his later career, much in the same way that Leslie Nielsen did when he started doing The Naked Gun and other comedy things. Goulet was a fine leading man, and in Blue Light, the movie version, Ideal in Danger, he does some really cool stuff with that World War II espionage framework. There are a few guest stars in there because each episode, of course, would have had guest stars. It's got the usual Nazi suspect actors like John Van Dreulen. I liked it. I like this as a kind of portmanteau of a bunch of the episodes. The series itself, I don't believe, has been released on DVD, but having this as a good memory of a series that really didn't find its pace in the 1960s American television landscape, it's quite worth watching, even though it is Frankenstein together, and has a little bit of meat on the bones. And of course, if you're a Larry Cohen completist and a Larry Cohen tragic like I am, you're going to want to have this in your collection. Next up, we got a classic from 1968, Lindsay Anderson's If, with Malcolm McDowell playing Mick Travis, a schoolboy at a posh public school in England, who's bullied by the older students. The teachers are all a bit unconcerning of the welfare of the children, and it ends in blood, guts, gore and death, which sounds about right. This is a movie that brought Malcolm McDowell to everybody's attention. Of course, he then went on to do A Clockwork Orange 3 years later, and he completed the Mick Travis trilogy. The character turns up in 2 other movies, which are Oh Lucky Man, which is fantastic fun, and then in the 1980s he was again brought back for Britannia Hospital. And the Mick Travis trilogy altogether make a really interesting arc of critiquing and satirising the UK as it was in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And If is where it all starts. It's very transgressive. It shocked people at the time, because all good movies of the 1960s shocked people at the time. Now, this is the Masters of Cinema version. It's actually got, I like my booklets, there's a Malcolm McDowell as he was then. On the back of it, they've got a whole bunch of little snippet reviews. One cited, "Oh dear, very close to bordering on fascism," said the BBC at the time. "Anderson is still lashing out at Nanny," said the Spectator. "My feelings are mixed. Why can't Anderson leave well enough alone?" The Times said it was an extraordinary film, a rich, complex metaphor for the way we live now. And there, of course, is more Malcolm McDowell. I like a good anarchic 1960s movie, like Carol Rice's Morgan, A Suitable Case for Treatment, with David Warner and Vanessa Redgrave. This is 1960s English filmmaking that kicks out of the establishment, kicks out at the ancient order, and shines a spotlight on the inequalities and the nightmarishness in some ways of English society as it was in the 1960s, let alone the 2020s. But this one's got a whole bunch of extras on it. If is definitely one you should have in your collection and enjoy. And Lindsay Anderson was a fantastic filmmaker. Not everything that he made landed well, but I think that his work was always interesting and always had a viewpoint and was always made intelligently. And If is definitely one of that. Next we have a 1950s Columbia Pictures movie starring Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Grahame, directed by Nicholas Ray, In a Lonely Place. Now in this one, Humphrey Bogart plays Dixon Steele, a screenwriter who hasn't had a real success in Hollywood since the start of World War II, which for Americans was 1941. And he's living in a little apartment complex and meets a lonely woman from across the courtyard, played by Gloria Grahame, who starts falling in love with him.
Did you see Mr. Steele last night?
Yes, as I came home, I saw him going to his apartment with a girl.
That girl was murdered between 1 and 2 o'clock this morning.
One of the beautiful things about this is that Dixon Steele is a really troubled character. He's got a really nasty temper. He's cynical. He's self-pitying in some ways. And then when a woman is murdered in the apartment complex, he falls under suspicion for being the murderer. And even though it proves in the end that he's not, his character weaknesses pull Gloria Grahame's character away from him. It's a really complex movie. The famous silent movie actress Louise Brooks did an essay about this, where she said Dixon Steele was the closest in film that Humphrey Bogart ever came to portraying someone like his real character. And that's kind of interesting. And In a Lonely Place is a very dark film. It's a well-written film as well. And it shows that change in Humphrey Bogart's acting and in the roles he took around the time of The African Queen, but after that as well, up until his death in 1957. He did some interesting roles in things like The Barefoot Contessa, for instance, and being miscast in Sabrina. The later roles of Humphrey Bogart really bear some attention and appreciation, because even though he hit his peak in the early 1940s, he did a lot of cool stuff after that. Next one's a favourite spy movie of mine from the 1970s, written by James Mitchell, who also wrote Callan, the TV series, and one movie, starring Edward Woodward as a government agent in the seamier side of things in London. But under the name of James Munro, James Mitchell did a series of spy novels with a main character called John Craig, who was a karate expert and an ex-smuggler, who was recruited by a very seamy part of the British Secret Service to help them out with various things. It was directed by Peter Collinson, who also directed The Italian Job. And it's a movie called Innocent Bystanders with Stanley Baker, Warren Mitchell, and Donald Pleasance, who's turning up a lot on this channel, as a guy called Looms, who's the head of the department for whom John Craig, the character played by Stanley Baker, works. He's an older secret agent in this, and there are some younger new recruits to the section with whom Looms kind of juxtaposes him, and he sends the two teams out to get an agronomist, played by Vladimir Chabal. He's got a secret that will allow deserts to bloom and be useful, productive land. And so Looms sends out the two new characters, played by Sue Lloyd and Darren Nesbitt, and also sends John Craig out as a scapegoat, going ahead of the other team, in order to stop the Russians and a group of Israelis from getting this guy before the English do. Really cool little thriller. It's so underrated. It didn't have an enormous budget, but it's got really great acting. Donald Pleasance is fantastic as Looms. Stanley Baker is really, really good as Craig, who's got a problem, but when the challenges arrive of the younger people who he trained, he rises to the occasion and he uses his experience and smarts to outwit all the other parties involved. It's a really nice little thriller. You can see a bit of the, you can see a couple of the stills there. It came at the end of that spy cycle in the 60s. This one's from 1972. Innocent Bystanders should definitely be on your list to get. This version is from Olive Films, which has just unfortunately collapsed as a company. But I saw this in the cinemas back in the 70s and liked it. And I think I even had it on VHS at one time. If you can find it, this one should be on your list. And just to show you, there's the original novel, and it's the movie release of the novel. I've got a couple of the John Craig thrills, and they're a really nice read. James Mitchell, even when he was writing under the pseudonym of James Munro, was a nice, tight crime and spy thriller writer. And the John Craig novels, if you can possibly find them, are worth having in your collection. The next one's a no-brainer. This is the Criterion Collection Edition, a comedy from the early 1960s, which was directed and produced by Stanley Kramer, where they jammed everyone and everything in and just made it an enormous, long but enormous, fun movie, which, if you've seen it once, you'll watch it again. It's a mad, 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 mad world. This one is fantastic. The ensemble cast is terrific. I'll just give you the top of the head. Spencer Tracy, Milton Berle, Sid Caesar, Buddy Hackett, Ethel Merman, Mickey Rooney, Dick Shawn, who has some great moments, Phil Silvers, Terry Thomas, Jonathan Winters, Edie Adams, Dorothy Provine, Eddie Rochester Anderson. The Three Stooges turn up with a cameo. Everybody who's anybody turns up. Jim Backus turns up as a drunken aeroplane pilot. It's just such fun and anarchic mad humour. It crams everything in, and this is kind of peak 1960s comedy in some ways. It's not particularly transgressive, but it highlights a whole bunch of comic actors. Widescreen photography on this is fantastic. The stunt work's fantastic. The escalation of the greed of the people who are told by a dying gangster that there is a treasure buried under a big W at a certain park in San Diego. The gangster's played by Jimmy Durante. And all the people who stopped for the car accident that he had hear about this treasure and all start racing after it to get it before anybody else does. It's a great premise for a comedy movie. And it's got that lovely virtue of having, oh yeah, there's that guy, I remember him, kind of things when somebody else comes in, like Marvin Kaplan comes in with Arnold Stang playing a couple of guys running a service station. Fantastic stuff. Well worth rewatching every couple of years if you can. I love having this version of it as well, because being a Criterion edition, it's got the booklet. It's a 2-disc set, so there are tons of extras on it. That one should be in your collection. A lot of fun. Now we're on to the J's, and this one is a deep cut. It's from the American Film Theatre, which did a whole bunch of movies in the 1970s, including an adaptation of The Iceman Cometh, which had Robert Ryan and Lee Marvin in it, as I recall. But this one actually has a Belgian focus. It's Jacques Brel's Alive and Well and Living in Paris. It's an adaptation of a 1968 stage review that was on Broadway, highlighting and translating the songs of Jacques Brel into English. It's the sort of project you think is unfilmable, but it isn't, and I'm a big fan of Jacques Brel's music. Oddly enough, contrary to what this says, I found out about Jacques Brel the day he died, because I was listening to the radio and they did a special on his music in 1979 when he died. And I listened to the songs and I was blown away, and I became a big fan of Jacques Brel's work. Jacques Brel's songs weren't your pop songs the way that, say, American or English pop songs exist. They were chansons, they were storytelling songs. And the French-Canadian production, directed by Denis Leroux, really illustrates the songs wonderfully. And there are three main characters. There's a Marine, there's a woman with a shopping bag, and there's a taxi driver. And the three actor-singers, Ellie Stone, Maud Sherman, and Joe Maziel, do a really good job of illustrating the songs and playing different characters. And it's a powerful musical. And at the end of it, we get the song Amsterdam, which was sung later by David Bowie, actually sung by Jacques Brel himself. So this one is a personal favourite of mine. It really is something different in cinema. And it shows that we need more diversity, I think, in the kinds of movies that are being made. And a few more musicals couldn't hurt, particularly when the songs are as well written and deep cut as the songs of Jacques Brel. That's a very deep cut hidden gem. Wonderful Johnny Cool, with Henry Silva playing a Sicilian gangster who goes to America and decides to take over the mafia. It does not end well. This one was directed by William Asher, whose wife, Elizabeth Montgomery, stars in it. This is before Bewitched. She plays a socialite who gets involved with Johnny, and things happen to him, things happen to her. He's a totally ruthless character, totally kind of sociopathic in a lot of ways. And he comes in from left field. The mob just don't understand him, where he's coming from. He says he's a made man, but is he a made man? Or is he the protege of a made man who is hiding from the mob in Sicily? It's got so many cool characters in it. Character actors like Joey Bishop turns up. Jim Backus turns up in a serious role. Brad Dexter, who was in The Magnificent Seven. John MacGyver, who people know from Breakfast at Tiffany's. He was the guy who was the counter clerk at Tiffany's in Breakfast at Tiffany's. He gets a really serious and nasty role in this. Mort Saul turns up. Telly Savalas turns up in this as well. Sammy Davis Jr. A hidden gem crime movie with the message at the end of it that you don't mess with the mafia, because the ending of this movie is as ugly in its ramifications as a movie like Seconds is. It really is a hidden gem. It's in black and white, but it is a really cool crime drama that you need to have in your collection. Then we go back to 1950s Jungle Adventures, because I love 1950s Jungle Adventures. And this one is in 3D. If you want to have it in 3D, there's a 3D version of it here. From 1954 in colour. Jivaro, starring Fernando Lamas, Rhonda Fleming, Brian Keith's in there as well, Lon Chaney Jr. and Rita Moreno. I just like this one. In it, Fernando Lamas plays a river trader called Rio, who meets a beautiful woman who is coming to meet her fiancé, who apparently owns a ranch in the Amazon jungle, but it turns out he's an alcoholic, played by Richard Denning, and they go looking for treasure, and the Jivaro Indians attack. It's a standard kind of colonial adventure, but I like it. I think it's great. Brian Keith playing the main villain in this is really good. I always love seeing Brian Keith in character roles rather than the light shit he did in the 1960s. There's the back of it. You can watch it in 3D if you've got the right kind of Blu-ray player. I happen to not have that, but I'm happy to watch this just in the colour version. It's a lot of fun to watch. It's a kind of Saturday afternoon movie on TV that I like revisiting now and then. It's a lot of fun, good solid adventure stuff. It's of its time and of its day, but it's really entertaining. Down to the last two. This one was clearly inspired by Shaun of the Dead. It's a Cuban-Spanish co-production from 2011, which I love. I watched it yesterday. Actually, I watched it early hours of this morning, and I love it. Juan of the Dead, which is basically Juan and his mate are slackers in Cuba. They live in Havana. They're a little bit criminal, but not too much. They spend most of their day fishing on a little raft that they have in the harbour, trying to get some fish. Juan is definitely a ladies' man and is incredibly resourceful. He was a soldier in Angola. He's lived through a whole bunch of unfortunate incidents in the history of Cuba, including the economic collapse that happened when the Soviet Union collapsed. He talks about that a lot. And he and his friend are on their raft when suddenly they see a corpse, and the corpse tries to attack them. So they get their spear gun out and shoot it through the head and promise not to tell anybody about it. But the zombie plague spreads through Havana and through Cuba, and the TV news broadcaster telling them that it's just dissidents who are paid by the Americans and not a zombie holocaust happening on the island. It's really funny. There are some great sight gags in this. There are some great political gags in it as well, if you know anything about Cuban history. And there's a really good one-er in this where Juan is walking home from a particular incident, and there's a whole bunch of really chaotic shit happening around him. It runs about 45 to 50 seconds, but it's beautifully done. And it shows that the filmmaker Alejandro Brugues really knows his stuff. And the main actor, Alexis Diaz de Villegas, really does a great job of giving us a unique character. Juan is a really interesting character in this. He has a small crew, a muscle man who faints at the sight of blood, a transgender person, really great crew they put together. His daughter has come from Spain to talk to him and is heading back to Spain to be with her mother, and so he needs to protect her from the zombies. The zombies are two kinds. There's the fast ones and the slow ones. You get a mixture in this. A hell of a lot of fun. Gory as hell. Terrific. And it ends on a wonderful grace note of Juan triumphant, which I really love. Definite hidden gem, definite one you should have in your collection, particularly if you're a zombie movie fan. This is another Criterion one I've got for you. It's from 1963, directed by Georges Franju, who directed Eyes Without a Face. And it stars Channing Pollock as a kind of vigilante who on the side of justice. It's based on a 1913 movie serial, which is a little bit like Fantomas, a little bit like Les Vampires, but it's actually Judex, which is Georges Franju again doing a beautiful kind of horror, kind of crime film. Anarchic vigilantes were a big part of Pulp Fiction in France in the early part of the 20th century. It's a lovely looking film. It's got some anachronistic technology in it, which I always love, and it's a thrilling, stylish, and wonderful little film, which I don't think gets enough love. I think that now there's a Criterion edition. People should start looking at it. Channing Pollock was a stage musician. He was an American and a very elegant looking guy, and he uses a little bit of that sleight of hand stuff for which he was well known in Europe in this one. There are deceptions, there are back and forths, there's disguises, there's people killed, there are people who are set up to be caught by the police. It's got all that kind of stuff in it. But Judex is a film I watch every couple of years because I just love the way Georges Farajou made movies. Usually watch this in a double feature with Eyes Without a Face, but definitely worth your time. And again, it shows how much wonderful film there is in non-English language cinema and how rich and beautiful and powerful the films of other cultures can be. Love that one a lot. So that's it for this time around. Next week, I'll be doing K and L, and there are a ton of choices in those two letters. I'm enjoying this particular series. It's a lot of fun for me. And rewatching some of the films, I'm not rewatching all of them, but rewatching some of the films is a really nice palate cleanser for me. Wednesday, I've got a big haul that I got from Viavision and Imprint. Next Saturday, I've got Science Fiction Saturday again. Sometime in between, I'll be doing my reviews of the Barbie movie and Oppenheimer back to back. So until then, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you think of these films and which other films in the letters I and J you would put into a list like this. You can also support the channel by donating at patreon.com/TerryTalksMovies. So until next time, when I've got more stuff to show you, watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some Cuban zombie movies and weird French thrillers, and I'll catch you next time.